Imagine a man walking into the financial capital of the world and calmly selling an entire country that simply did not exist. He did not sell a fraudulent piece of real estate, or a fake gold mine, or a non-existent company. He sold a sovereign nation. He invented a flag, composed a national anthem, printed official currency that felt crisp to the touch, and appointed government officials for a kingdom that was nothing but empty, hostile wilderness. He sold land grants to wealthy aristocrats, military commissions to ordinary shoemakers, and a utopian dream to hundreds of desperate families who packed their entire lives into wooden ships to sail across the ocean. What happens when hundreds of men, women, and children finally arrive at the edge of the world, step off their ships carrying their fine china and grand pianos, only to realize the paradise they bought was a deadly illusion? And how did the mastermind behind this massive psychological manipulation not only get away with it, but manage to convince some of his very own victims that he was entirely innocent? The answers to these questions defy all logic, yet every single detail of this absolute madness is entirely true. To understand how a lie of this magnitude could be swallowed by the smartest investors of the era, you have to picture the atmosphere of London in the early 1820s. The Napoleonic Wars had finally ended. The British economy was booming. Banks were overflowing with cash, and interest rates on safe government bonds had plummeted. People were hungry for high returns, and they were looking across the Atlantic. South America was in the middle of a massive revolution. The Spanish Empire was crumbling, and brand new countries were appearing on the map almost every week. Colombia, Chile, Peru, Argentina. It was an age of discovery, an era before satellite images or global communication, where the map of the world was still being drawn in real time. If a man in a brilliant military uniform stood in a London tavern and told you he had just returned from a newly founded republic, you had absolutely no way to pull a device from your pocket and verify his claims. You had to look him in the eye and decide if he was telling the truth. And nobody had a more convincing gaze than Sir Gregor MacGregor. MacGregor was not a street hustler. He was a Scottish aristocrat, a charismatic, towering figure who had actually served as a soldier and fought alongside the legendary Simon Bolivar in the South American Wars of Independence. He had the scars, the medals, and the commanding aura of a hero. When he arrived in London in 1822, he did not come quietly. He arrived demanding the respect owed to royalty. He introduced himself not as a mere general, but as the cacique, the prince of the sovereign nation of Poyais. Poyais, he claimed, was a massive, incredibly fertile territory situated along the Bay of Honduras, roughly the size of Wales. He told the high society of London that the local native king had been so impressed by his military brilliance that he simply gifted him this vast, untouched paradise. But MacGregor was a genius of human psychology. He knew that rich people do not invest in vague stories. They invest in details. They invest in administration, bureaucracy, and paperwork. So MacGregor did not just tell stories about Poyais. He brought it into physical existence right in the heart of the British Empire. He opened an official embassy of Poyais on a prestigious London street. He hired a public relations team. He began issuing official Poyaisian government bonds, raising hundreds of thousands of pounds in a matter of weeks. The financial district of London went completely blind to the truth, because the paperwork looked so incredibly official. He printed beautiful, intricate Poyaisian dollars that investors could exchange for their British sterling before their voyage. But the absolute masterpiece of his deception was a 300-page guidebook about the territory, supposedly written by a Captain Thomas Strangeways. This book, which MacGregor secretly wrote himself, is a masterclass in the art of the perfect lie. It described the capital city, St. Joseph, as a thriving metropolis with wide paved streets, a grand opera house, a cathedral, and a majestic parliament building. The book claimed the rivers of Poyais were literally lined with chunks of solid gold. It stated that the soil was so miraculously fertile you could plant crops 3 times a year without any effort, and that the local trees dripped with expensive sap. He even wrote that the water was so pure it cured diseases. It sounded like an absolute fantasy, but because it was bound in thick leather and filled with exact, fabricated geographic coordinates and fake census data, people completely bought it. After all, why would someone go to the trouble of writing a 300-page book if the place did not exist? The trap was set, and the prey rushed in. MacGregor was not just targeting the ultra-rich. He specifically targeted his fellow Scots. knowing exactly how to play on their national pride and their desire for a better life. He sold thousands of acres of land at 2 shillings an acre. He sold non-existent government jobs. An ordinary tailor from Edinburgh bought a commission to become the official shoemaker to the Princess of Poyais. A struggling clerk bought the title of Chief Bank Manager of St. Joseph. Families sold their ancestral homes, packed up their farming equipment, their best clothes, their silverware, and even musical instruments, preparing to take their rightful places in the high society of a tropical utopia. They were stepping into a dream, fully financed by their life savings, completely unaware that the man waving goodbye to them at the docks had essentially signed their death warrants. In late 1822 and early 1823, the first 2 ships, the Honduras Packet and the Kennersley Castle, set sail from Scotland carrying over 250 eager colonists. The journey across the Atlantic took 2 agonizingly long months. The passengers spent the voyage studying their fake maps, practicing their new official titles, and dreaming of the Grand Opera House of St. Joseph. You have to imagine the pure, electric anticipation as the ships finally approached the coast of Central America. The captain navigated by the exact coordinates provided by His Highness, Gregor MacGregor. They dropped anchor. The colonists stood on the deck, looking toward the shoreline, waiting for the harbor master to greet them, waiting to see the golden domes of the capital city, waiting to see the paved roads and the friendly locals. Instead, they saw nothing but an impenetrable dark green wall of untamed jungle. There was no harbor. There was no city. There was no opera house. There was absolutely nothing but the deafening sound of insects and the oppressive, suffocating heat of the Mosquito Coast. At first, the passengers refused to believe they had been conned. The human mind has a terrifying ability to protect itself from reality. They convinced themselves there was simply a navigational error. Perhaps the capital city was just a little further inland. Perhaps they had landed on the wrong side of the bay. They unloaded their heavy wooden furniture, their delicate china, and their winter coats onto the muddy riverbanks. They sat in the swamp, waiting for the Poyaisian authorities to arrive and apologize for the mix-up. But as the days turned into weeks, the crushing, horrific truth began to set in. They had been abandoned at the end of the earth. The tropical rains began to fall. Their fine European clothes rotted in the humidity. Their food supplies dwindled. And then, the real nightmare began. Malaria and yellow fever swept through the makeshift camp. The newly appointed chief bank manager of St. Joseph found himself desperately trying to build a shelter out of palm leaves while burning with a lethal fever. The official shoemaker to the princess realized he was standing in a swamp where no one even needed shoes. The fake Poyaisian dollars they carried in their pockets were entirely worthless to the local indigenous tribes, who looked at these starving, delusional Europeans with absolute bewilderment. The dream had violently collapsed into a desperate struggle for basic survival. By the time a passing ship accidentally discovered the camp months later, the situation was beyond tragic. Out of the 250 colonists who had sailed with such high hopes, fewer than 50 survived the ordeal to be rescued and taken to a nearby British settlement. 2/3 of the settlers had perished in the mud, clutching worthless pieces of paper. The survivors were eventually brought back to London, carrying the shocking truth of what the Prince of Poyais had done to them. The British press exploded. The story of the non-existent country became the biggest scandal of the decade. The public demanded the head of Gregor MacGregor. The authorities prepared to arrest the mastermind behind the most elaborate and devastating fraud in the history of the British Empire. But this is where the story shifts from a mere historical tragedy to a testament to the absolute absurdity of human nature. When the survivors returned to London, something completely inexplicable happened. A significant number of the very people who had watched their families die in the jungle, who had lost their entire fortunes, absolutely refused to blame MacGregor. They publicly defended him. They signed declarations stating that the cazique had simply been let down by the organizers of the expedition, or that the local officials had failed him, or that they had just been unlucky with the weather. The psychological phenomenon of sunk cost fallacy was so incredibly strong that these victims could not accept that the man they worshipped was a sociopathic liar. MacGregor had manipulated them so deeply, so flawlessly, that his illusions survived even the violent collision with reality. Of course, MacGregor did not stick around to test his luck. Before the British courts could move against him, he packed his bags, took the massive fortune he had stolen, and quietly slipped across the English Channel to France. And if you think a man who had just orchestrated the deadliest fraud of the century would go into hiding and live out his days in quiet luxury, you severely underestimate the pure, unfiltered audacity of Gregor MacGregor. Within months of arriving in Paris, he looked around at the wealthy French aristocrats, smiled, and did the exact same thing again. He opened a new embassy. He printed new maps. He translated his absurd 300-page guidebook into French. And incredibly, the French elite began buying land in Poyais. He was moments away from sending a fleet of French ships into the exact same deadly swamp. The only reason the French colonists did not suffer the same fate was that the French government noticed an unusual number of citizens applying for passports to a country that none of the state geographers had ever heard of. They launched an investigation, finally arrested MacGregor, and threw him into a French prison for a brief period. Yet, like a ghost slipping through the cracks of history, MacGregor ultimately avoided any serious, long-term consequences for his actions. After his brief imprisonment, he eventually returned to South America, where the new governments remembered him only as a war hero from his earlier legitimate military days. He settled in Venezuela, requested a military pension, and spent the rest of his life living comfortably in the capital. When the man who had sold a phantom country, ruined hundreds of lives, and pulled off the most magnificent and destructive con in the history of capitalism finally passed away, he was not buried in an unmarked grave as a criminal. He was buried with full military honors at a state funeral, celebrated as a hero of the revolution. We remember Gregor MacGregor today not just as a criminal, but as a dark mirror reflecting the absolute limits of human belief. His story is not really about a fake country in Central America. It is a story about the devastating power of a confident narrative. It proves that if a lie is massive enough, detailed enough, and delivered with absolute certainty, people will not only believe it, they will defend it with their dying breath. MacGregor understood a terrifying truth about the human condition. People do not buy land or titles or currency. They buy hope. They buy the promise of a better life, a fresh start, a utopian dream where rivers run with gold and the weather is always perfect. And as long as people are willing to close their eyes and dream, there will always be a cazique of Poyais, standing in a brilliantly tailored uniform, holding a beautifully painted map, ready to sell them the absolute void.